had always been someone who believed in the ordinary. A few creaks in the floorboards, a few drafty windows, nothing too unsettling. But this apartment, this new place I had decided to call home, was different. I was in my early 30s, having just gone through a messy breakup, and I was looking for something new. A fresh start. A change of scenery. This old building in the heart of the city seemed like the perfect escape. The apartment was cheap, perhaps too cheap for such a prime location. The landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Meyer, was pleasant enough, but there was something odd about her demeanor. She was quick to sign the lease and almost desperate to get me into the apartment, as if she were glad to be rid of it. I thought nothing of it at the time. Everyone has their quirks. The building itself was ancient. The paint on the walls peeled in some spots, and the hallway had a musty smell, like wet paper and damp wood. My new apartment was on the top floor, number 305. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a strange energy. The place was dark, even during the day, with the curtains drawn tight. The floorboards creaked as I walked across them, echoing louder than I would have expected for an empty space. It was unsettling, but not in a way that made me want to leave. It felt familiar somehow, like the kind of place that would make a home, given time. I set to work unpacking my things. The apartment was small, just a living room, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and one bedroom. Nothing extravagant, but it was enough for me. I unpacked my books first, placing them carefully on the shelves. I opened the fridge and stocked it with food. I hung my clothes in the closet, and when I was done, I stood in the center of the living room, surveying the place. It didn't feel like home yet, but I was sure that with time it would. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard something. A soft scratching sound, almost as if something or someone was moving behind the walls. I sat up straight, my heart racing for a split second, but I quickly shook it off. It was probably just the house settling, right? Buildings made noises, especially old ones. I tried to ignore it, but the scratching continued. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I rolled over, pulling the covers over my head and drifting into an uneasy sleep. The following morning, I woke up feeling sluggish, but I pushed through it. I had a new start ahead of me. I got dressed, made some coffee, and sat down to plan my day. But as I glanced around the apartment, I noticed something odd. There was a small crack in the wall behind the bookshelf. It wasn't there when I moved in. I would have noticed. It was faint, barely visible, but I could make it out if I looked closely. I stood up, walking over to the bookshelf, and gingerly ran my fingers along the crack. My heart skipped a beat as the wood beneath my fingertips felt strange. The shelf was old, certainly, but the crack was definitely new. Something didn't add up. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to move the bookshelf to see what was behind it. It wasn't particularly heavy, but as I slid it aside, dust filled the air, causing me to cough. And there it was behind the bookshelf, a door. It wasn't a regular door. It was hidden, camouflaged perfectly in the wall, almost as though it had been sealed shut years ago. The handle was rusty, its edges jagged and worn. There was no keyhole, just a strange pattern etched into the door, almost like a symbol. It was so out of place in the otherwise ordinary apartment that I felt a strange pull towards it. A mix of fascination and fear gnawed at my stomach. What was behind this door? Why hadn't I noticed it before? I couldn't resist. I reached out and turned the rusty handle. The door creaked open, groaning as if it hadn't been touched in decades. The air that rushed out of the small opening was cold, too cold for such a warm day. It smelled of mildew and decay, a heavy, sour stench that made my stomach churn. I stepped into the narrow hallway behind the door, squinting in the darkness. The passage was small, almost claustrophobic, with the walls pressing in on either side. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was there some sort of hidden space I hadn't been told about? A storage room, perhaps? Or was I simply imagining things? I walked down the passage, which seemed to stretch farther than I expected. My footsteps echoed in the confined space, and the silence surrounding me felt oppressive. Then ahead, I saw a faint glow. I reached the end of the passage and saw the small room. It was dimly lit by what appeared to be an old, flickering light bulb in the ceiling. The room was small and cramped, filled with dust and cobwebs. In the far corner was a strange, old armchair, brown leather, cracked and worn with age. The curtains on the windows were drawn shut, their fabric fraying, and on the floor, covered in dust, was a mirror, its glass cracked and dirty. But the most bizarre thing of all was a lockbox. It sat in the corner, next to the armchair, almost as if someone had left it there. It was heavy, made of iron, and engraved with symbols I couldn't understand. It looked ancient, older than the building itself. I felt a sense of unease wash over me. My heartbeat quickened, and the air in the room grew heavier, thicker. Something was wrong. But what? What was this place? I stepped closer to the lockbox, drawn in by its mysterious presence. As I reached out to touch it, I heard a noise behind me. A soft, faint sound, a scrape of fabric against wood. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty passage behind me. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I was no longer alone in this room. I left the room quickly, slamming the door shut behind me. My mind was racing, but I couldn't make sense of what I had just discovered. My heart pounded in my chest as I returned to my apartment, locking the door behind me. That night I tried to sleep, but the noises began again, softer this time, but unmistakable. A tapping, like something was scratching at the walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the house settling. But as the tapping grew louder, I knew something was alive behind those walls. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The images of the hidden room, the crack in the wall, the mysterious lockbox kept invading my thoughts. And that scraping sound, it wasn't just in my head. I could hear it again, louder now, like nails dragging against wood. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to drown out the noise, but it was impossible. It felt like the very walls of the apartment were alive, pressing in, suffocating me. The next morning, I didn't feel much better. I tried to go about my day normally, grab some coffee, run errands, maybe distract myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every time I passed the wall where the bookshelf once stood, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, as if expecting to see someone or something watching me from the crack. The hair on the back of my neck stood up every time I passed that spot. At work, I couldn't focus. My co-workers probably thought I was being overly distracted. I barely spoke to anyone, hardly ate my lunch, and spent most of the day lost in my thoughts. The hidden room, the cold air, the strange symbols, and that lockbox. I needed to know what was inside it. My curiosity was eating away at me, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more obsessed I became. After work, I rushed home. The apartment seemed quieter than usual, too quiet, in fact. The tapping had stopped. At first I felt a sense of relief, but then I realized the silence was even worse. It was unnatural. I made my way to the room again, heart pounding in my chest. I knew I shouldn't go back there, but I couldn't resist. I had to know what was behind that door. I had to know what was waiting for me. The door opened with a soft creak, and I stepped into the narrow passage again. This time, the air felt colder, sharper, like a blade of ice cutting through me. The strange sense of dread that had taken hold of me the night before was back, stronger now, more insistent. I reached the room. The chair was still there, in the corner, and the curtains fluttered in the breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. But it was the mirror that caught my attention. It was no longer just cracked, it was shattered. The glass had splintered into jagged edges, and the reflection that stared back at me was no longer mine. I gasped and stepped back, but the figure in the mirror didn't move. It wasn't me. It was someone else. A woman. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, but her eyes, those eyes were the worst part. They were empty, hollow, like two black pits staring straight through me. I stumbled backward, my chest tight with panic. The woman in the mirror didn't smile or move, but there was something in her eyes, something terrible. I felt as if I were being drawn into that empty gaze, as though I was being swallowed whole. The scraping sound returned closer now, louder, coming from behind the wall. My heart raced as I turned to face the source of the noise. I looked at the lockbox, still sitting in the corner, untouched. It was as if it was waiting for me. I walked over to it, hands shaking as I knelt down. I could feel the weight of it pressing on me, as though it were alive, waiting to be opened. Slowly I reached for the symbols etched into its surface. They looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I had seen them before. Without thinking, I grabbed the box and opened it. Inside was a collection of old photographs, each one faded with age. They were all of different people, but all had one thing in common. They were all taken in the same room, this very room. I turned the first photograph over, and written in the back in faded ink were the words, "Alice missing, 1942. I froze. The name Alice struck a chord deep in my memory. The landlord, Mrs. Meyer, had mentioned an Alice when I first signed the lease. She said the apartment had once belonged to a woman who had disappeared without a trace. But these photographs, these were from decades ago. Each photo seemed to tell a similar story. People posing in the room, but always with an unsettling air about them. Eyes wide, unnatural smiles, and a hollow, empty look that mirrored the woman in the shattered mirror. I flipped through the stack, each one more disturbing than the last. The next photograph showed a man, standing in the very spot where I had stood just moments before. His face was twisted in a grotesque smile, his eyes staring at something just out of frame. The third photograph was of a woman, her hand outstretched, as though reaching towards something, or someone just beyond the camera's lens. But her face was filled with terror. Her mouth was open, as if screaming for help. I turned the last photo over. There was no name on this one, but there was a date -1955. The man in the photograph looked like he had been there for decades, his skin withered and yellow. His eyes were sunken, his body thin and frail. And behind him, standing in the doorway of the room, was someone else. A shadow. A figure too distorted to make out clearly, but the shape of it was wrong. Too long, too twisted. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The figure in the doorway wasn't watching me. Suddenly, the air in the room grew thick with a heavy presence. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath in the air. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. The mirror. The woman was gone, but her reflection was still there, except now it was something else. In the glass I saw myself, but my reflection was distorted. My face was smiling, but it wasn't my smile. It was wide, grotesque. My eyes were black, hollow. The figure in the mirror was me, but it wasn't. It was something else, something darker. I reached out to touch the glass, and the reflection mirrored my movements, except it was faster. My reflection grinned, its mouth widening impossibly, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. Then, I heard the scraping again, but this time it wasn't from behind the walls. It was from the floorboards. The sound of nails, claws, scraping against the wood right beneath my feet. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to run, but the door was gone. The passage that had led me to this room was sealed. The walls were closing in around me, and then, I saw a shadow moving across the floor, growing larger, faster. It wasn't human. It was something far worse, something I couldn't comprehend. My breath hitched. There was no escape. I woke up in a cold sweat, my body trembling uncontrollably. My eyes snapped open, and I found myself lying on the floor in the room, the hidden room. The mirror, the lockbox, the photographs, everything had vanished. In its place, the room looked normal, even mundane. The cracked floorboards, the dust-covered armchair, the moth-eaten curtains, they were all as they had been when I first discovered this place. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? My mind raced, trying to make sense of the nightmare I had just lived through. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. The moment I stood up, I felt a presence. A heavy, oppressive weight in the air that seemed to press down on my chest. I turned toward the corner of the room. There, in the shadowed darkness, something moved, just a flicker of movement, but enough to make my blood run cold. My heart pounded, and a sickening realization settled over me. I wasn't alone in this room. I took a step back, my feet unsteady on the old wood. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to get out of this place, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, a prisoner of my own terror. I didn't know what was in the shadows, but I felt it. It was watching me, and it was waiting. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard a sound, soft like the rustling of paper, followed by a low, wet cough. My breath caught in my throat. The sound wasn't coming from the shadows. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. But what I saw made me wish I hadn't looked. The woman from the shattered mirror, she was standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, and her eyes were wide, unblinking. She was wearing a long, tattered dress, stained and torn at the edges. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and her fingers were bent at odd angles, like they had been broken and never healed. But it was her eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, that made me freeze in place. They weren't just empty, they were empty of anything human. A void. Something dark and ancient stared back at me, and it felt as though she could reach into my soul and tear it apart with a single glance. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The woman took a step forward, and I felt my body tremble with fear. She didn't move like a normal person. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like her bones were being forced into motion by invisible strings. Each step was slow, deliberate. Her eyes never left mine. The closer she got, the more I felt my own will drain away, as though I were being pulled into the black abyss of her gaze. And then a voice. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. "You shouldn't have come here." I could feel the words deep in my bones, as though they were not just spoken, but imprinted into my mind. They echoed in my ears, reverberating through the walls of my skull. My breath hitched, my legs giving out beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor. The woman continued her slow advance. "You're not supposed to know." The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch, reaching toward me like skeletal hands. The temperature in the room dropped so quickly that my breath turned to mist, fogging in front of my face. I could feel the darkness pressing in from all sides, suffocating me, pushing me closer to the woman. Her face, her hollow, unblinking face, loomed closer now. So close I could see the faint trace of dried blood on her lips. And as she opened her mouth, a wet, gurgling noise came from her throat, like something trying to escape but failing. Suddenly, my body surged with a jolt of adrenaline. I wasn't going to let her take me. I pushed myself backward, scrambling to get away. I couldn't think. My only instinct was to get out of this room, out of this nightmare. But the door had disappeared. The passage that had led me in was now gone. The walls were closing in, the space around me shrinking. I couldn't breathe. The air was too thick. There was no way out. "It's too late." Her voice was sharper now, more insistent. And then, I saw something else, something moving inside the shadows behind her. I couldn't make it out, but it was massive. It slithered, coiled, and undulated, its shape ever shifting, like a living thing, no, something more monstrous than anything I had ever seen. I gasped, my mind racing as I tried to understand what I was seeing, but the truth was impossible to grasp. I had stumbled upon something far worse than any ghost or monster I had imagined. This place, this apartment, was not just haunted. It was a prison, a place where the dead and the living bled together, where time itself was broken, twisted. Suddenly the woman's hand shot out. Her fingers wrapped around my wrist with a strength that I didn't think possible for someone so frail. Her grip was icy, and it felt like ice was running up my arm, freezing everything in its path. And then everything went dark. I don't know how long I was out, minutes, hours. It felt like I had been trapped in that room forever. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor, my body stiff and aching. The air was still cold, but the shadows seemed to have receded. I slowly sat up, my head spinning. My legs were trembling, my throat dry. The room was empty. The woman was gone. The shadows had faded. But the lockbox was still there, sitting in the corner, untouched. The photographs were still inside. I grabbed them, heart pounding. I needed answers. I needed to understand what had happened. As I flipped through the photos once again, I noticed something I hadn't before. The faces were the same, the people who had lived here, who had disappeared. But now, there was something different. On the back of the last photograph, I found a name, Aiden Meyer. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The landlord, Mrs. Meyer, her name. The connection. She was one of them. I looked up from the photograph, my mind reeling. And then, I heard a soft creaking noise. A door opening. I turned, my body frozen with fear. There, in the doorway, stood Mrs. Meyer. Her eyes were wide, dark pools of emptiness, and her smile, her grin was twisted, grotesque. And she whispered, her voice low, almost loving. "You've been chosen." I stumbled back, my legs shaking beneath me, as Mrs. Meyer, the landlord, stepped into the room. Her smile was still there, stretched too wide, her eyes black and empty, like the endless void that had swallowed the woman in the mirror. She didn't speak, but the air around her seemed to thicken with something ancient and malevolent. It was as if the very walls of the room were vibrating with a dark energy that I couldn't see, but could feel in every inch of my skin. "You've been chosen," she repeated, her voice quiet, like a lullaby, but there was a deadly edge to it. She wasn't speaking to me as a tenant anymore, or even as a human. She was speaking to me as something else, something older, something that had been waiting. The lockbox, still sitting innocuously in the corner, seemed to pulse with an almost imperceptible rhythm, as though it were alive. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat echoing in my ears. The air had grown thick with dread, suffocating, like the very room was holding its breath. And Mrs. Meyer, her smile widened further, as if she could feel the terror I was experiencing. "You don't understand, do you?" she said softly, her voice like the crackling of dry leaves. "The room is a gateway, a threshold. It's not just a room, it's the room. And once you open it, it doesn't let you go." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, as if her words had paralyzed me. The horror of what she was saying was starting to seep into my mind, flooding it with questions I didn't want to ask. What did she mean by gateway? What was this room really? Why had she brought me here? Mrs. Meyer stepped forward, her footsteps slow and deliberate, her eyes never leaving mine. The shadows around us seemed to stretch and writhe, like they were alive, listening. "You see," she continued, "the room was built for one purpose: to trap souls. It was created centuries ago, long before this building existed, long before any of us existed. It was built on the ruins of something older, a place where the dead were bound to the earth." My mind raced to make sense of her words. My eyes flickered to the photographs in my hands, the faded faces, the names written on the backs, all those people who had disappeared over the years. The people who had lived in this apartment, only to vanish without a trace. "You didn't think it was just coincidence, did you?" Mrs. Meyer's voice was like a snake's hiss, low and insidious. "The disappearances, the missing tenants, they're all part of it. They come, they stay for a while, and then they vanish, forever." I finally found my voice, though it was weak and shaking. "What are you? What is this place? What happened to them?" She took a step closer, her smile turning into something much darker, much colder. "I'm the keeper," she whispered, as though the words themselves were a secret too terrible to be spoken aloud. "I watch over the room. I bring people here. You, Samuel, were chosen because you found it. Most don't, but you did." She looked down at the photographs in my trembling hands. "You opened the door, just like the others. And now," she paused, letting the silence hang in the air like a guillotine. "Now, you're part of it." I could feel the walls of the room closing in on me. The temperature dropped even further, and my breath came out in clouds of mist. The shadows seemed to deepen and stretch, and I realized with a start that they weren't just shadows. There were shapes moving within them, things that shouldn't exist. I could feel the weight of them, the eyes watching me from within the darkness. The woman from the mirror, the one with the hollow eyes, appeared again, stepping out of the shadows. She was no longer just a reflection. She was real, solid, her face twisted in that grotesque, unnatural smile. And behind her, I saw more figures, more faces, each one the same, empty, hollow, lost. The souls of the ones who had lived here before me, trapped in this hellish limbo, forever bound to the room. "You're not the first to discover it," Mrs. Meyer said, her tone almost sympathetic, "but you will be the last." Before I could react, the woman lunged at me, her arms stretching unnaturally long, her fingers scraping at the air with an awful, hollow sound. I screamed and tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The room, the walls, the floor, everything was closing in. There was no escape. The shadows were thickening, swallowing the light, consuming everything in their path. The lockbox. I needed the lockbox. I didn't know why, but I knew it was important. The moment the woman's hand reached for me, I bolted toward the corner of the room, grabbed the lockbox, and tore it open once more. But this time, there was something new inside. The photographs were still there, but they were alive. Their images flickered, like old film reels spinning too quickly, as if the faces were moving. The eyes blinked, followed me, and then they stared at me from within the photographs, those faces, those hollow faces. And on the back of each photo, the ink was fresh. The names had changed, My name was written on the back of the last photo, under the word missing. It hit me then, the terrifying truth. The room didn't just trap souls, it consumed them. And now it had claimed me. I heard Mrs. Meyer's voice again, this time louder, more triumphant. "You'll never leave, Samuel. You're already a part of it. And soon, you'll be one of us." I felt the cold fingers wrap around my neck, the woman's twisted form closing in on me. I gasped for air, my body going numb. The shadows swallowed everything, pulling me deeper into the darkness, into the abyss of the room that had taken so many before me. My vision blurred, the last thing I saw being the faces that trapped souls looking at me, waiting for me to join them. And then, there was nothing. The next morning I woke up in my apartment. I was back in my bed, lying under the covers, the sunlight streaming through the windows. It felt so normal, so alive. But something was wrong. I sat up, the room feeling off. The walls, the floor, everything looked the same. But when I glanced toward the corner of the room, I froze. The bookshelf was gone. And there, where the bookshelf had once stood, was the door to the hidden room. I stood, my legs unsteady as I walked toward it. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. It was cold to the touch, and I hesitated. But the door opened with a creak, revealing the narrow passage. The darkness inside seemed to reach out, pulling me in. And then I saw it. The photographs. The faces. They were waiting for me, watching me. I stepped forward, and the door slammed shut behind me.